Today is Sunday, the 3rd of October, and the theme of the Autumn Rebellion is climate colonialism. We must end the silence about the colonial exploitation that Finland benefits from. We will be here to call for a policy to slow down the climate crisis that will dismantle global inequality and colonialist structures. The word "we" is often used a lot to prevent climate change. We need to reduce our emissions, or we need to change our consumption habits. If it's unclear to whom we are referring, it is difficult to outline the unequal power structures that will accelerate the eco-crisis. Who do we mean when we say we? Who has the most power in society and with it responsibility and influence? When we say we, do we recognize that the richest tenth of the world produces half of all global emissions, thus destroying our common environment and consuming our common resources? When we say we, do we know that the poorer half of the world, that is 3.5 billion people, produce only 10% of all global emissions? These arrangements must be taken into account in emissions accounting and climate policy. At present, for example, Finland causes large emissions outside its own state borders because its market and economy are built to be dependent on goods produced elsewhere. At the same time, in official programs and action maps, these consumption-produced emissions produced elsewhere are not counted as part of the climate load for which Finland is responsible. This is an escape from responsibility and climate colonialism. The problem is outsourced. Finwatch, an association that studies the global impact of business, informs us that Finland's consumption-related emissions are up to 33% higher than what is officially stated to be. This gives a false picture of the carbon footprint of Finns. Concretely, climate colonialism is also reflected in, for example, emission compensation. Emission compensation means monetary compensation, a business that seeks to offset the effects of greenhouse gas emissions caused elsewhere in the global south. Emission compensation is a cheap way to pretend to be an environmentally friendly brand. At the same time, emission compensation reinforces the notion that a certain type of production and pollution is necessary. Emission compensation does not therefore seek to change the colonial structures of production or shrink the carbon footprint of rich countries. Well, how does this climate colonialism, racism, and culture of overconsumption come together? Modern colonialism manifests itself as power structures in which the global North exploits natural and other resources beyond its own state borders, seeking its own economic growth. This creates economic and social inequalities between people living in different areas as wealth accumulates. Inequality is growing and accelerating all the time when colonized areas do not have the resources to protect themselves from the environmental problems caused by the climate crisis. Those communities and states that do not overspend, like our Finns, experience the effects of the climate crisis first and foremost. Temperatures will rise the most, about 4 degrees, in West Asia, North Africa and the Arctic. Sea level rise due to the melting of glaciers threatens many island and coastal states. Heat waves are becoming more common around the world, and in West Asia, for example, they are already causing critically high temperatures for working. At the same time, drought and famine are increasing as societal problems, especially in Central Asia, India and Africa. For these reasons, it is predicted that living in the Middle East and North Africa will no longer be possible in 2050. Restoring the natural relationship between the majority of the Western population is necessary to slow down the environmental crisis. Indigenous peoples have long known about the devastating consequences of the climate and environmental crisis, and their know-how would be much to be learned in rebuilding sustainable societies. Otherwise, the acceleration of the eco-crisis may drive the overuse of resources in Western overconsumption culture into hubris. Often in politics, environmental issues are perceived only as a struggle for power and resources and clinging to Western technological solutions that will enable green economic growth. Finnish climate policy completely ignores the knowledge of our relationship with nature and living as a part of nature. Information systems based on Western science and information systems from other cultures should complement each other in solving the environmental crisis. The mindset that blames eco-crisis on the human species and population growth is problematic, and it is a basic tenet of eco-fascism. There are not too many people. The problem is that resources are distributed unequally globally, as we have gone through here. And the root cause of this inequality is the history of racism and colonialism, the continuum of which the Finnish culture of overconsumption. The accelerator of the eco-crisis is not the human species. That line of thinking is eco-fascist. There are many different types and levels of eco-fascism in our society. There are open racist and eco-fascist movements whose actions are guided by a mindset that human whiteness leads to superiority and supremacy. These movements may, for example, demand borders in response to the accelerating eco-crisis. It is important that we clearly condemn open racism. There is no room for eco-fascist movements in Finland. At the same time, eco-fascist thinking can be also unintentional. As a child in primary school, I learned that the climate is warming because of the high birth rate in Africa. This is an eco-fascist idea. Most racism is unconsciously produced, and in the same way, eco-fascist thought patterns can be unconsciously learned through socialization. Eco-fascist thinking can be visible or more difficult to identify and unintentional. Eco-fascism resurfaced through the COVID-19 pandemic. There was talk in the media that nature is taking over, that people are a virus, and that when left inside our homes, nature would take over cities again. Population growth is not accelerating the eco-crisis. We will continue discussions about these topics on climate colonialism here near Mannerheimintie in Helsinki at our Autumn Rebellion. Thank you for watching this. Mä en tiedä kuinka kauan.